Okay, everybody, we get started. Just wanted to let people know that those of you who are standing or even sitting on the floor, there are more chairs on the way. So, first of all, thank you all for coming. This is our first Education Forum of the new academic year. My name is Claire Gordon, the Director of the Eden Centre, and I'm really delighted we've got such a nice mix of academic staff, professional staff and students here to discuss this really important topic. And so thank you for coming. And we know it's a very busy time of the academic year, but this is a very important topic of student voice, and we know that it's a word that's often bandied around. People talk about student voice, and it's a category in the NSS, and yet at the same time, do we actually know what we're talking about? And so we wanted to take some time today to explore what the notion of student voice actually means, what it means to us, what it means to our students, and also to sort of take some time to consider the different spaces and places, whether they're physical or online, where students may have the opportunity to have voice in the classroom, in the curriculum, as well as in the broader student experience. Without sounding glib, I think there's something very powerful and profound about the idea of enabling all students to feel that they're able to bring their full identity into the classroom, onto the campus. At the same time, we have research, which is led by our inclusive education team in the Eden Centre, which clearly suggests this is not always the case, that all students do not feel they have voice, that they are able to bring their identities into the classroom, onto the campus. Another thing we want to do today is ask ourselves, how do we respond? What do we do with that voice once students have shared it with us? And that's also not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to share your voice and then feel you're not being heard, you're not being listened to. I did just want to briefly say something about the events in Israel and Palestine. I think we're all affected in different ways by what is unfurling in the Middle East, and we're affected to differing degrees personally, politically, academically, and I felt it was important to mention that right now, and I discussed this with my colleagues yesterday as well, Lydia and Akile, because this is also a question about voice and creating space where we respect differences, different points of view, and that I hope that when we come into this space today, we come with a degree of humility and a desire to understand, and where we do disagree, we do that respectfully and with a desire to know. And I think these are really important values that underpin higher education and should underpin all our discourses, whether they're in the classroom, in a forum like this, or just walking across the campus. How do we come with humility and treat each other with respect? The last thing I want to say before I hand over to Akile Ahmed, who's our Head of Inclusive Education, who's going to facilitate the first panel, is to say that some of you may know that the Eden Centre has a fund, a catalyst fund, for development and innovation projects. Some people don't like the word innovation, some people don't mind it. It's all about thinking about how we can do education better and work in partnership with our students to make education better and to make students' journeys through their time in the university a positive, life-changing experience. So in line with today's focus on student voice, we're introducing a new Spotlight Award this year, encouraging colleagues such as yourselves who may hear something that you think is really interesting or that you'd like to pick up and investigate further in your department, on a course, within your program. This is an opportunity for you to apply for some funding, work in interdepartmental teams, staff-student partnership teams to explore some aspect of student voice that you're interested in. The deadline for submissions, this is all on our website and we'll be sharing more details after today's session, but the deadline for submissions is November the 26th. You'll be alerted of the outcome in December the 11th, and then we're going to organise a bit of a showcase where your ideas and your evolving projects are presented to, you don't know about this yet, but Emma McCoy, our Vice Chancellor for Education, and James, don't know about that yet either, SC General Secretary, and others. So we're really we realise that, just to say finally, that making educational change takes work, and we know that people are busy and feel very overloaded. So maybe It's not huge amounts of funding, but maybe some funding can open up ways for you to carry forward projects in collaboration with others or with students who may also be looking to engage in these topics and also be paid for their labour. So thank you all for coming today. Apologies, I'm glad the room is full up, it's really nice, but I know it might feel a bit squeezed for some of you as well. So I'm going to hand over to Akile, and we'll get going. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I can invite James and Miriam to the front.
I'll sit on the big chair.
I'll
spin around. That's okay.
So the first panel, as you will have seen on our programme, is focused on what is student voice. And I'm really pleased to introduce our panel of speakers today. So as you all know, this is Professor Emma McCoy, who needs no introduction, but I will say she is our Vice President and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education. And we're also really lucky to have James Ralph, who is our LSE GenSec, our new incoming, now well and truly established, I think, in the role. And finally, by no means least, we're really lucky to have Dr. Miriam Tresh from the Department of PBS. So I've asked each of our panellists to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes on what is student voice. So a really big topic. And then I will have some questions for you all, and then we'll open it up to the floor as well. So I'm going to invite Emma first to share what you understand to be student voice. So thank you, and I will tell you more.
Okay, yeah, and I'll watch my clock. I mean, I think clearly it's something that Claire's already noted is that isn't really, I think, well understood. But I can kind of talk about, I guess, how the government might view student voice and how I disagree, I think, quite fundamentally with some of that approach to what is meant by student voice. Because if you look at the National Student Survey, you look at NSS, and you look at the questions that are under the student voice category, it talks very much about kind of feedback and things that I think really define student voice then quite narrowly, because I think student voice is much more about, okay, there is a question about how do you think you're, whether it was listened to, I suppose. But I think for me, student voice is much more about a kind of active participation of students in our classroom. And I think that there are so many barriers, institutional barriers to student voice that come from how we as academics, I think, teach in the classroom, and some of these barriers of assuming that we know what our students should be learning. And I think if that is your starting position as a teacher, I think it's then very hard to really hear student voices. Because I think that it should be a much more dialogic process. I think learning should be much more dialogic, and I think that and of course, we still need to do these performative things that we do already. So I think if you go back historically, probably when I was an undergraduate, I wasn't even ever surveyed, I don't think. I was never really asked my opinion of how my teaching was. So at least we've made steps forward. So we have student surveys, and then we have things like student representatives on staff-student liaison committees. And that was probably where we got to, if we go back 10, 15 years, that was the limit of what student voice meant. And now, of course, there's more work. We're doing some more partnership work. We have things like student panels. But I still think that quite a lot of the things that we do really are a little bit performative. They're a little bit, okay, let's do some compliance to convince everybody that we're listening to students. And so I think a lot more of it has been said, what do we then do? It's more about kind of active listening. All of these terms get bandied around quite loosely, I think. But I think that it's how we actually work with our students, I think, in terms of their agency for their education. And I think that is really important, and is probably what I think we should be aiming towards. And I think some of the surveys often drive against some good behaviours, because you tend to focus very much on getting good results in NSS, for example. However, having said that, I think that there are some more, just that might be seen as quite transactional. There are some transactional things that we can do that can drive good behaviour. That might seem quite performative, but actually then ensure that our staff are engaging and reflecting, even if it's about teaching delivery, if it's about how we address some of the responses to some of the survey questions, for example. And I think one of the big problems that we have with representation versus student voice is I see student voice as something that should be across the whole school and for all students. And I think probably at the moment a lot of our voice work is very much for the small number of engaged students. So I think I want to find ways that we can listen to those voices that are currently silent. Or marginalised because of how we're teaching in the classroom, where they don't necessarily feel that they're in a position to be heard or don't have the confidence to raise their voice. So I think it's how we actually listen to all of our students is something that I think is really important. And there's a lot of work going on in this space, and in fact what sometimes I find quite depressing is that if you go back to some of the early work of kind of some of the psychologists that worked in education, Dewey, for example, people that are working 80, 90, a very long time ago. And I remember the name, there's an amazing female professor at Cambridge, Jean Ruddock, I think is her name. And she, a first female education professor at Cambridge. And she did some amazing work on student voice. And she died in, I think, 2007. And I don't know that she said some amazing things, and it feels as if we're only very slowly making progress. We're now 15, 20 years on, and we know what we need to do. And I think that sometimes it's the institutional barriers that we need to fix first to enable us to actually make progress in this space. But I would say let's work away from being kind of more performative about it. It's not about ticking boxes, it's about really listening and acting on our students' opinions.
Thank you, Emma. And I think you've captured something really important about listening and how some voices are just not listened to rather than heard. I'm going to ask James now for your reflections. I mean, it'd be interesting for you to think about your time as a student and then now moving into your role. So over to you, James.
Sure, yeah. I think what's sort of quite important to note first is Emma and I were in a meeting earlier this week, and one of the questions that someone put to us was, do we have a 360-degree understanding of our students? And I don't think we do at all. I think the way LSE works is obviously it's very decentralised with departments. Your departments have a lot of data and a lot of understanding about that student's individual experience, what their opinions, what their concerns are with the course. That data isn't necessarily shared to the centre or stuff to do with even the Students' Union. We have a lot of understanding of what students are engaging with our societies, what students are active and voting in the elections, committee positions in societies. And I think, what it means is it sort of segments our understanding of students. It means that departments look at students from one perspective, we look at students from another. And if we were to basically combine and look at all of the data together, we'd obviously have a lot to say about student voice. Another thing to note, I also think that student voice is happening all across LSE. It's happening, as I said, in departments, in the Students' Union. And it's all these little different circles of student voice that we need to square. We square these circles and bring together what we already have to get another understanding of students. In terms of the feedback loop, I always think that with students, we ask for feedback potentially sometimes too quickly after something. So maybe we'll put an event on, and within the event, we'll ask for feedback straight away. Obviously, that's quite intimidating for students. It's not very, I don't think it's very appropriate. And it almost, once again, seems very performative, as if, we're running this event and then wanting to get feedback straight away. So I think there needs to be some distance between, wanting to ask for feedback for student voice and organising or what the reflection of that event is. In terms of the way we treat feedback from students and student voice, I like to think of it more as a sort of diagnostics. When you've got a problem with your laptop, you'll go to the IT help desk and they'll issue basically a ticket. They'll get an understanding of what your problem is, and then to close the feedback loop at the end, they ask you, has your concerns been answered? Have we resolved the issue for you? And I think if we sort of treat it more logically that way, it means that students feel like when they're saying their concerns to us, the unions actually, the union and the university are both acting on what their requests and what their concerns are. Because I feel like far too often students are being asked for feedback, and it seems as if the university is not acting upon that feedback. So maybe it's sort of noticing and signposting what the university has done. there's a problem we have in the Students' Union is that we over-democratise things with student voice. We have a trouble of basically wanting to get too much consensus. And I think what that means is that, you know, we want everything to be voted on. We want everyone to be a rep. We want to have different levels of the schools all over representative, you know, represented in their own way. But the trouble with that is that it seems sometimes quite tokenistic. You know, we have these figureheads who are potentially, you know, I guess, you know, in our situation, Sarah. So, you know, Sarah's a welfare and liberation officer. There's lots of different students involved with welfare and liberation, but a student may feel like it's only comfortable to go and talk to Sarah about it. There's other ways in which they can get involved with liberation events and other items within the school. And I think what we need to be more conscious of is being more proactive rather than reactive to the feedback. Recent NSS scores, you know, we were responding to those. I think if we were potentially more preempting of them and we were carrying out feedback in more creative ways throughout the year, then when it came to the NSS result, we would have almost expected what the responses would be. And I think that comes from, as I said, more creative ways of receiving feedbacks, looking at the structures we have in place. Students feel somewhat overwhelmed and yet under-informed in the ways in which they can voice their concerns. You know, we think about, we can do it via democracy, we can do it via student feedback, we can do it through Dequaro surveys. There's all sorts of ways in which students can voice their concerns. And I think maybe reflecting on the systems we have in place and making sure that we can streamline the mechanisms in which students can voice their concerns is important. And I think just, you know, overall, just before I close, making sure that we don't lose sight of those students which are underrepresented. You know, we've got some students which are home students who won't necessarily attend campus or come to campus. What are we doing for those students? We run lots of surveys in halls and all the residencies where we get feedback from those students, but I really do feel as if there's a very active, engaged population at LSE, and there which we sort of act upon their feedback. We're potentially neglecting a lot of the students who are not in that category. So I'd be interested to see what, you know, the floor thinks about that, but also ways in which we can modernise our systems with AI and other systems as well to make sure that the feedback we receive is I guess proactive rather than reactive and you know, more diagnostic, making sure we're closing that feedback loop. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, James. And I'm quite interested in your ideas around the timing of feedback and how quickly and how slowly should we go forward.
Well, we did brilliantly on NSS. It was 5 years after they graduated, rather than when they're sitting there.
I don't know. Maybe the opposite might happen.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, my son, I know he trashed LSE when he was here in the NSS, and now he thinks his education was brilliant. I'm like, oh God.
Interesting. Thank you so much, James. Miriam, over to you to hear about what you've been doing with your course and in your classroom. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm actually going to pull on a few of the threads that you both spoke about, which is quite nice. I would also start that this isn't going to be a complete critique of surveys. I think there is huge value in surveying our students as a form of student voice, right? That we can use that to make process changes, and that's hugely valuable. But I think student voice actually is much bigger than that. Student voice, particularly what we're doing in PBS, is an opportunity for students to be able to express themselves, articulate themselves, their interests, their passions, what they want to do later, and we kind of have different opportunities for them to do that. And I guess I want to make this point around student voice being that opportunity for expression. I guess in two ways. Is one is that critique of surveying our students based on it being almost a satisfaction metric, right? And just say, you know, change this for us because this would make it easier. And again, there's value in that because we're not in their position. We need to know those things. That sometimes a process or a procedure isn't working. That's hugely valuable. And second, to think about the ways in which we actually can create opportunities in the classroom and in the programme for them to express themselves. So that kind of critique of the traditional surveying, those process changes are always important, but sometimes I think, sideline the value that we bring as the experts in teaching them, both as discipline experts and expert educators. Sometimes we have a clear justification for why a process is like it is, And, things like, why are our deadlines set at noon? Well, we don't want to, have students working till midnight. So we try and avoid that and have it at noon. Why don't we upload sample assessments, for example? Well, we don't want our students to just use them as a template. We want them to be able to express themselves. What's really important actually is that point around dialogue that you mentioned, and actually opportunities like SSLC is where, rather than just saying, ignoring that feedback from students, we actually have a dialogue with them in those sessions, and we say, we completely understand, this is why we have it, but this is why our deadlines are at noon, this is why we'll talk about sample assessments in class, but we won't just have them online for you, right? Those opportunities, so I think surveys are great for that, and then as long as, and I think really importantly, we're having a dialogue with them about it. And then second, I think, is, as I said, student voice being that opportunity to express themselves. I will say with PBS and our undergraduate program, we were really lucky to be able to build it from the ground up with a small cohort. So almost building an undergraduate program in partnership with students was hugely valuable. And I know with kind of long established programs, it can be difficult to kind of do that. So that's the caveat, but this is not the perfect way. This was built from the ground up with them. But I think we do it in two ways. We do it through how we develop our courses in partnership with our students, and also through the assessments that our students do. And I'll take, I think, almost like a case study from PBS. So we have a course for our third year undergraduate students called Advances in Psychological and Behavioural Sciences. And the aim of that course is really to get students to look at what are the realities of applying the intellectual foundations that they've learnt about in the first 2 years. How does that actually play out in the real world? We talk about kind of from the ivory tower of this is what psychological and behavioural sciences could do for policy and real world problems. And then we, start thinking about, well, how does that actually work in reality, right? How do you scale that? How is that ethical? And all of these big questions. And that course is external speakers and maybe faculty members our students haven't heard from before doing that work, right? So they're out in the real world doing that work. We ask them to come in and speak to the students. And what's really important is that we actually speak to our students and ask them what they want to hear about and who they want to hear from. So we build, it's a very kind of, almost like a swan you're paddling underneath, making sure you've got a schedule for that course. But it really pays off because students, especially by third year, are relatively clear on what they want to do, what they're passionate about, where they want to go. And so they want to hear from people doing that. And so we build that entire course really around wanting to hear from them. So we do that in course development as much as we can, and then also through our assessments. So throughout the entire program, we have a huge number of diverse assessments. They do, podcasts and opinion pieces and all of these different types of assessments. And we actually keep the assessments relatively open and wide in scope for students to be able to explore their interests. And this is why we kind of see assessments as an opportunity for student voice, right? They can use those different types of assessments to express themselves. And again, if I continue with this kind of case study, maybe I'm biased because it's the one I helped design, but we do a couple of assessments in there that I think really centre student voice within that. So the first one they do in that course is a showcase portfolio. So the kind of caveat is as part of the, sorry, not caveat, as kind of addition to this, part of that programme is we have created this fictitious behavioural science consultancy firm. So we tell the students they're going to apply to a job at this firm. Obviously, they are all guaranteed a job, which is very nice. And they use that showcase portfolio to apply for a position in this consultancy firm. And the aim there is for students to have to showcase pieces of summative work they've done through their time with us. But really importantly is to reflect on that. So they get an opportunity to reflect on their time at LSE, the work they've produced, the topics they've really focused on, and demonstrate almost like their intellectual contribution, which I think is really important part of student voice, right? That they are learning kind of cutting edge research in a discipline, and they are very well trained in methods, in theory, that they can actually make a strong intellectual contribution to the field, and they'll do that through demonstrating their skills and their knowledge in a job application. And then they are guaranteed a job, which is always very nice. And then we continue it and we run a simulation event with them. So they've been hired. We have a whole simulation day where they've been given a client project who wants to know about how can they use psychological and behavioural insights to better understand this real world problem. It could be climate change, it could be administrative burden, any sort of big problem that our client has. And they have to work together in those professional roles. They have to really draw on their skill set, reflecting on the knowledge that they've gained, and they put together a white paper. And the reason I think this is really representative of student voice is that these get to go out to people who are like genuine stakeholders in the real world, right? So, the head of department will make sure that people working in the real world, at the UN, in government, will get to have a look at or hear about the work that students are doing. So I think, as I said, huge value in the surveying aspect, but actually student voice is much bigger, and it's creating opportunities in the classroom for them to say, I've learned all of this. I bring my personal experiences, I bring the critical skills that I've developed, and here's my intellectual contribution, right? How I can apply psychological and behavioural insights. So, yeah, I guess my main point is kind of going beyond that and thinking about that intellectual contribution.
Thank you, Miriam. You've touched on something that I think the next panel will also speak to in terms of this intellectual contribution and writing, because obviously the work we run out of the Inclusive Education team talks a lot about decolonising the curriculum. But some of that is also about what we're writing about in our essays, in our reports, or our students feel confident that the person reading it will absorb and consume in a decolonial manner as well. So thank you for that. I know we don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm actually going to hand over to the floor for immediate questions and online. So colleagues online, if you do have questions, please raise your hands. We'd really like to hear from you all as well. So yeah, opening up. You can say your name as well.
Yes. So I'm Simran, I work with the Eden Center as of now, and I'm a very recent master's student, so I've just graduated in September. So I know every survey that you're talking about, I've possibly filled up all of them. And I do believe that LSE at least attempts to act on it, because I've had institutions previously that were just doing it for the sake of it. But the one thing that I felt was out of touch was, even though we were giving feedback, we were not the recipients of the change caused by that feedback. So it felt like we were in an endless loop where no matter how much we try, no change would come in our tenure, because it was just a one-year course. So how do you act on that in a small given point in time? How do you potentialize student voice in that time frame?
Well, you can through dialogues, I suppose. You can do it through learning. And I think even I used to teach when I was at Imperial. I haven't yet taught at LSE. When I was at Imperial, I always used to run kind of pulse surveys during the term. So I literally would say at the beginning, if there is something that that you want to kind of raise with me, do it now, because you have 11 weeks of me, and unless you tell me, then I can't change. And I think it's having those dialogues. And I think back to the points about designing assessments. So this may be partly because it was very helpful for me, but one of the assessments that I always used to have was, and I used to teach in statistics, was getting the students to design an assessment. So they would design a multiple choice question, and then they'd all be brought together, and I had about 80 or so students. So I'd have a multiple choice question, and then they had to all analyse those questions, saying, right, what learning outcome is it addressing? So I think there are things, again, that you can do that really help the students, again, back to that engaging with the course, that helps them think about, what am I trying to learn? And then I'm being listened to. And then we'd have a big discussion about why that was a useful exercise and so on. So I think it's you can do those things, embedding them in the course, rather than just doing the standard, right, I'm just going to deliver the content of my course and then ignore everything that you bring to me. And of course you can always do it with staff-student liaison committees, where there are discussions where things get raised and addressed kind of in term rather than the following year. But I do think students like to see as well that we listen. So I do think it's worth reflecting on what did you do last year, to change, so I think it's just a general making sure that we are letting the students know that we do listen and we understand their issues. However, having said that, I think a lot of the things that do come back, it's back to that, well, no, we don't do it that way because, and I think it's having those discussions so students really understand why we are teaching in the way that we're teaching and why we take the approach that we take.
Yeah, I would just think that as well. I also think there are huge cohort effects. I don't know others' experiences, but there are, you will make changes for one cohort and they kind of are implemented, and then the next cohort will not.
Yeah.
So you're constantly chopping and changing, and actually that can be difficult. But and that's where the dialogue comes in, right? To say that actually this change was made you know, through a discussion with the previous cohort. But actually, sometimes we don't always need time to, I think, again, to the point of evaluation, like when we're asking for feedback, we don't always need a bit of time for things and processes to settle in before we actually ask them, is it working? So, yeah, I think those cohort effects, yeah, occur as well.
Yeah, I just think sort of the more creative ways in which you can gather student voice, the better. I know that as a student, you know, last year, the year before, the bombardment of just surveys you get. Obviously, surveys work very well for staff, they work very well for the school because it's easy to quantify it and put it into spreadsheets and whatever. But I think we are forgetting the customer here. You know, we're forgetting the people we're actually asking the data from. I think we had a meeting with someone earlier in the week, I can't remember who it was exactly, but they talked about just basically in one of their classes giving students a pen and paper and then just writing down what feedback they want from the course. You know, what have I done well so far in my teaching? What do I need to improve on? And something just as simple as a pen and paper, you know, you've got people in a room. I think the trouble is that far too often in the classes I had last year, the teacher would dedicate 20 minutes to fill out the survey. A lot of students aren't, you know, properly or sufficiently filling out that survey. They sit there, they just, I don't know, browse the internet or something else, or the submission they even put within that survey aren't actually that beneficial to the school. So I think, you know, thinking about more creative ways to do it, giving people a pen and paper, and I think the more creative, the more that will sort of hook the student to think, oh yeah, I actually do want to engage in this. Because if you've got 20 different surveys and it seems very transactional, you know, you do this survey, we'll give you a free coffee. I think we need to think about more creative ways to get what the end goal is, which is student voice.
Thank you for those answers. I think they're definitely something very constructive, and as a student, they make me feel like my voice is being heard. So thank you for that.
Any questions online? Is there anybody? You can feel free to type your question in the chat as well. Claudine, and then
Okay, I've been at LSE for 25 years, and to be perfectly honest, I still don't know what people mean by student voice. Is it immediate feedback in a lecture, in a seminar? Is it the ability to change education in a very deep way? Is it all of it? So I'm not that surprised that our ratings are so low, because I think that we're not talking about the same thing. And you know, I'm just thinking, should we have a big conversation about what it means for teachers, for students, for educators, for PSS teams, you know, and to kind of be more, to attempt to be more clear about what it means for us.
I think that's a good idea, and I mean, I know that Claire is already starting to think about getting a group together to kind of define what we mean by it. I mean, and I think to your point, clearly there are now several definitions of what is meant by student voice for the kind of HEIs, certainly nationally here. But I think that there are also, and we're in a social science institution, right? So there are lots of competing views about those definitions as well, and what is the right approach to student voice. And I think a lot of it does come back to, James used the word customer, which I think is kind of interesting again, because how do you, that frames our community in a particular way as well, which I think that we have to think about. And I think a lot of it comes from, and there, again, there are lots of people that don't believe that you should take a student-centred approach to education on grounds that they feel are very well justified academically. So I think that I agree, and it's great being at LSE as well, and back to surveys, which of course is a really central methodology in a lot of the research that we do as well, which raises, you know, again, a proliferation of surveys and things. So, but we need to be a little more focused about being effective, I think, in this space, rather than just, oh, let's send out another survey because that will answer this. And it won't necessarily unless we apply our very rigorous methodologies around survey design to this particular question writ large in a whole school approach, back to the 360 point that was made earlier by James, and the fact that we don't currently have that 360 degree view.
Just conscious of time,
Sorry.
I know there was a question at the back, and then I'm going to ask James and Miriam to address that one, just to give you some time as well, sorry.
Hi everyone, Luca Tardelli, IR department. First of all, just a quick kind of come back to the earlier point, which I think is crucial, right? Students, you know, they provide feedback, what you can act on. One other, I mean, very humble suggestion we tried a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, I don't remember now, is also to use peer study groups to ask students. I remember we did this at the end of the first term, of the Michaelmas term, as it was called at the time, and we asked students, what is that you enjoyed so much so far? What is that you actually learned, that you were completely surprised to learn, and you know, what is that is not in the program yet, right? And it was a different kind of feedback because it was focused on learning, on student perspective on that, but also more at the program level. And it's something, you know, we couldn't change much right away, but at least it turned out, you know, we organized a small event because we noticed there was a gap in what we were not teaching that year, so we organized a small event. And it's just a minor thing, but it did, and it gave us actually wonderful feedback. To you know, feedback that I don't get through the surveys. On the question for the panel, I think it was Miriam. You mentioned something that to me was like, you know, as soon as you said it, so yes, that is exactly the direction, which is the move I think we need to do from student voice to dialogue with student. Because the dialogue exactly takes two, right? And what I've seen so far, I think is great that we move to this kind of, you provide input and we tell you how we can act on it. But you're correct, I think you mentioned something that we should go back to and discuss this with our students. Sometimes we cannot act on that feedback, but not because we don't want to, it just makes more sense to do things in this particular way. And I think we have the duty to explain this to the students. I hate when we don't explain things to the student. It just, I think, is the easy way out, right? No, that's it. No, we need to make an effort. But I think a challenge that I'm seeing today is that there is, and it's not the majority of students, but there is a kind of an attempt sometimes to students to think, okay, you're not acting on this, I'm going to insist on this. I'm going to come back to this. This is a kind of form of campaigning, which I think is completely wrong. And I wonder whether the solution is to have, first and foremost, some agreed rules or charter expectations about, you know, we're in a dialogue here, right? We're all trying to be better at this. But I wonder whether we're missing that kind of basic rules, or whether there are other solutions you may want to think about. Not just you, Miriam, but also James and others. Sorry if it took long, but that would be my question.
Thank you. No, it's a really good point actually, because it's something that we've also been discussing. Like, there is this dialogue and we sometimes have our justifications for why something is the way it is. That doesn't stop that same point being repeated. But actually one thing we have been in discussion is around kind of expectation setting early on, or, you know, can you, again, maybe putting on some behavioural science insights, you know, can you get them maybe to sign a contract at the beginning or something, you know, like applying these principles, but essentially set out expectations, or what are some things that are the way they are because they have to be like that, and having that dialogue with them on why it is. And I also think it's important that, you know, especially as cohorts grow, and some of the programs in this school are a huge cohort, it's impossible to keep every single student happy. It's very important that all students have a voice, but I think particularly we come to those sorts of like process changes or structural changes, it is realistically going to be impossible to make all of them happy. We even had the conversation around when it was, you know, online lectures and live lectures, and you know, some students liked this and some students like that, and you know, we did it as best we could to you know, meet everyone's expectations, but ultimately you won't. But I think, yeah, important that dialogue with them and maybe setting out expectations for students on what can be achieved is really important. And yeah, we are looking at other ways to be able to do that as well.
I was just going to say briefly, yeah, I think the human element is really important. I think now we've come back on campus, making sure we prioritise these human interactions, but also recognising people who don't engage within those. So, you mentioned about your study groups, asking for feedback, you know, potentially even office hours. As students come to you with a concern, are there other things outside of that question with the course? You know, I think using this human element and continuing that dialogue as well, So there's more consistency. You know, it's not you sign this feedback, we get a response, okay, we'll do whatever we're going to do. It's almost, you know, continuing stuff within the classroom to office hours to study groups. So throughout the term, the student feels supported. And just going back to the point earlier about sort of what is student voice? Well, I think everything's student voice because we can't really decide what it is because when the student, you know, decides what answer they want to put for the NSS score, it's their own interpretation of student voice. So it's almost, regardless of what we may think about it, it's whatever their interpretation is. So therefore, we've got to make sure that everything's covered. Yeah, that was just sort of it in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. And sorry, Daniel, we've run out of time, but Daniel has typed into the chat his question. So please do. Oh, he has to go. But yeah, thank you so much, Miriam, James, and Emma. Thank you to those of you that have asked some questions. We're going to move on to our next panel. Can we invite the next panelists up? Just do a bit of moving around in chairs.
Yeah, okay, good.
Looking forward to starting the next panel.
Okay.
We're just about to start the next panel, so if you could make your ways back to your seats, anybody that's got to grab coffee. Sorry, we're so short on time, and I know it's really hot in here and packed, but over to you, Lydia.
And just to assure you, we'll have plenty of time for group discussions after this panel. So thank you all so much again for joining. And it's my pleasure to be facilitating our second panel, which I think speaks really nicely and will hopefully build on some of the discussion points that were raised by James, Miriam and Emma in the first panel. So this one's going to be looking at what enables students to express their voices and feel heard in the classroom. And if I could start off by asking our panellists to introduce themselves. If we go to Olivia first and then work down the line with the panellists in the room.
Good morning.
I'm Sarah Onifade. I don't have that much academic accolades in comparison to Olivia. In my second year of international relations, so no Luca, and I'm the Welfare and Liberation Sabbatical Officer.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jillian Decker. I just finished my MSc in Gender, Media and Culture last year, and I'm here to speak about my Changemaker project, which had to do with understanding students' needs from a safe space for learning.
Hi everyone, I'm Nigam. I'm a final year PPE student here at LSE. Having taken courses in lots of different departments, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my experiences with course feedback.
Hi, my name is Jean-Christophe. I'm at the Media and Communication Department. I'm an associate professor there, and I'll be sharing a few tricks and tips, hopefully useful, about voice in the classroom.
Great, thank you very much everyone. So similar to the panel that we had before, everyone's going to take it in turns to speak for around 5 to 10 minutes about their take on the panel question. And then we'll have time afterwards to open up to the audience for Q&A, so both everyone here in the room and online as well. So if any questions come to you during the presentations, feel free to pop them in the chat and then that'll make it easy for us to come to it at the end of the panel. Okay, so Olivia, would you like to go first? Yeah.
set of 5 lessons. Really, a set of new interactions and things that people can listen to that are compulsory, but those are all kind of the things that really stabilize what lessons like this is going to be able to teach. And so I try to explain to them how important it is to be productive, that students are able to use this as a productive classroom environment. And in very practical terms, and obviously with 16 students, I think this is a big group of students, it means that everybody gets their space. And often input or feedback is really important for the classroom. And I do this usually sit with the participants here in the class at the table in terms of having a discussion. And then other elements that are very practical concepts, so it's not politics or nothing, but it's actually to just have the discussion. Everybody gets comfortable with what they might think or something like that. And so I do try to make the distinction between what their opinion is and what they like to learn, which is not always very easy, but I'm open to the bigger picture for them to input. And so very briefly before this other activity takes place, the elements. So at the end of the class, what students always say is that it was they thought it was very productive even before I was speaking briefly. But by the end of the class, part of it was important first and foremost, but also it's like the only thing that I really think is actually to share their sense of experiences. But also there's other skills that have to be developed. So what a lot of some of the exercises is that every day I invite them to create a video and then they will receive, it's 10% of the input, they receive the marks when they do it. I don't try to put them in a perfect environment. And so the aspect that I really try exactly to hone the skill is a very analytical thinking, which is the thing that I always say that I'm good at. So these very simplified approach is that allows them to do it first very analytical way before they even get to the evaluation part of the text, but also get them to think of why does evaluation matter beyond what just writing, the text. I have changed also this year where can you please after a while to start rather than recording something to actually have writing each other. So someone does a reflection in class about something. So again, to hone the thinking, because there's always learning from the text, and try to think about if you have to address something else, something that also brings out other opinions. And then lastly, even less good maybe, is that what happens in the class when everybody is speaking is that they actually visualize what they can read in terms of the different texts. And everyone can get the picture of this and put that in the slides that they create. So they have also this archive of various conversations that we have. And then as a very last comment about making maybe the sense of the assessment. So the methodical assessment, but it's actually a precursor to the summative one. So the summative assessment is the 2024 year. And the portfolio consists of both, again, their skill to do a summary, a critical summary of the reading, and that reading they need to modify it to reflect the student's potentials. So that means that the summarized reading is an engagement with the aspect of critical thinking. And not limited to anything they're interested in, but also choose topics that might have perhaps engaged with what they have said. But again, they need to make the essay relevant to that. And so that's something that I do this year in the formative assessment. I really focus on this. So I think I've been speaking long, so I'll take a break. I hope I gave enough been able to come to meet you all and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Okay, so now if we return to the panellists in the room, Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate the prompt that was given to panelists, it was what enables students to express their voices and be heard in the classroom. And in terms of my reflection, I was thinking about what makes me feel confident? How do I express my voice? And I think the key thing is that, as James touched on, that human-to-human interaction with academic staff, in terms of I make a class contribution, is my teacher just acknowledging and moving on? Or is he actually giving me the time to express that this contribution I've made has intellectual integrity? And I think a key thing for me as well is, of course, I understand academic staff are educators, but in terms of the role that they have in the personal development of students. And I study IR, but I do love sociology, so a key thing for me is always, internal, external factors and looking at the institutional barriers that certain students might have in terms of class confidence and how that plays out in a classroom, and how certain teaching styles might not be accessible to all students. So something I've experienced as well, that if you just have an open discussion, you can maybe see patriarchy play out in terms of maybe the boys in the classroom feel more confident to speak over each other, maybe the girls might not. So in terms of trying to think about how can you facilitate race to make sure you can do your best to provide that accessible environment so we won't have these institutional barriers play out as well. Another key thing that Dr. Olivia said, and something that I have experienced in my IR classroom in terms of visualizing the contributions as well and sending it to students afterwards, and in terms of being reactive to what students are saying as well. And then another thing as well, in terms of one thing that I had in my IR 205 class was every single week a student had to do a summary of the reading. And in terms of maybe, picking a student to say a contribution at class might be quite daunting, might be quite frightening, especially for first years who they're coming into such a big environment for the first time. But I think in terms of doing something in which students can be prepared, in terms to show up for themselves and to show, this is their contribution to their discipline as well, which is something that I found quite intellectually stimulating and quite nice as well. And just in terms of, again, cultural capital as well, I think a key thing for me is that my parents raised me to be a very confident woman. Everyone says that, but in terms of I know the way society works, it's not something that was just a given. And I remember that I had gone to a student hall and I had a lot to say. Emma, you were there. Mark Allison was left, but you were there. And Emma had emailed me afterwards about my contribution, and just that slight interaction of I said something, you actually reflected on it and emailed back, made me feel as if oh wow, something I said has credibility for her to email back. So I think a key thing as well is getting back to how can we make the classroom more accessible and thinking about how certain teaching styles in general might not be neutral. And then in terms actually treating everybody's contribution with a sense of intellectual integrity. And it's kind of like an informal joke between students when you say something and the teacher's okay, moving on. And in terms of how that can affect the confidence of different students differently, some are black women, maybe I will take that differently to someone who's bright and middle class, in which they already have that academic confidence, they already have that cultural capital in LSE. So in terms of being more understanding, and of course understanding that your roles are educators and to teach your academic discipline, but also for the personal development of some students. In terms of our motto is, understanding the causes of things for the betterment of society. So always having that goal in mind of how can we help facilitate our students to be the best version of themselves possible. I think that's all to say.
Yeah, so I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of background on my Changemaker project. So my project surveyed taught master students within the Media and Communications department, actually, to try to get towards students' understanding and needs from a safe space. So the project had three main goals. The first was to craft a diverse, equitable, and inclusive definition of a safe space. The second was to understand how students saw this space, handling common learning disruptions. And the third was just to offer some preliminary guidelines for enacting the student vision. So for those who have explored some of the debates and scholarly literature around safe spaces, it may seem somewhat counterintuitive to be giving a talk on how safe spaces and student participation overlap, because there has been such a large backlash against safe spaces and the idea that this can sort of quite quickly become an echo chamber or a policing environment that actually then paradoxically reduces student voice. And this was a paradox I was particularly interested in when I started developing this research. So I asked a question specifically in my survey to understand how students saw a safe space encouraging inclusive participation and sharing. And what my research found was that not only did students have many suggestions for creating inclusive classroom environments, but they actually defined a safe space by the variability to openly communicate and share within the classroom. So, as I said, students defined a safe space for learning as one that encourages everyone to freely share their ideas and thoughts regardless of background. They mentioned safe spaces allow others to speak without interrupting, speaking over, or for others. Students directly mentioned that encouraging this open communication for all does not mean leaving problematic views unchallenged, but it means going about these conversations and potentially divisive debates in a respectful way, and especially in a non-confrontational manner. And then, in conjunction with open communication, students also understood the import of actively listening. So this has been brought up a lot, but students really stressed that active listening is so important for open communication because students need to closely listen to each other to prevent misunderstanding, but also to facilitate that common respect within a classroom space. And then in terms of policy recommendations students had for encouraging this type of participation, the first thing that was mentioned was maintaining some sort of classroom confidentiality. Such confidentiality, students felt, granted them the confidence to try and fail within the classroom space without having to worry about that failure following them beyond. And again, I think that this could particularly help that threat or idea of a safe space becoming in some way policing or punitive. The other thing that was mentioned, that's also been mentioned quite a few times today, is the importance of maintaining open and continuous feedback mechanisms. So students understood that creating an inclusive and participatory safe space is a process that must be developed in the long term. So alongside this were calls for the implementation of continuous anonymous feedback forms where students could raise concerns and suggest amendments to the classroom environment so that they could continuously participate in the learning process as it developed and changed across the year. In a similar vein, having open office hours where students can come with any concerns or need was also mentioned. These mechanisms are so important because they ensure students, A, have a voice in the classroom environment, and B, it allows staff to be aware of any problems or concerns that might be stifling participation on a daily basis. The other thing students mentioned was the importance of fostering respect across difference. So students understand that learning environments should be diverse, and they want the identity of all students and the viewpoints of all students to be brought into the classroom space. But they understand in order to do that, respect has to be developed so that there isn't any sort of shame around difference that can stifle participation. Students mentioned that this respect can be fostered through staff acknowledging and recognizing difference, such as asking about people's cultural backgrounds or preferred pronoun usage. Additionally, other students mentioned that taking steps to utilize diverse readings outside of white Western male thinkers was important for fostering classroom inclusivity. This first step in decolonizing the curriculum helps encourage understandings of different cultures, again, helping to facilitate that respect within the classroom space. And also just ensures those from a variety of backgrounds feel seen and can bring their personal experiences into that classroom space. Students also had multiple recommendations to encourage everyone to be able to contribute to a discussion within a classroom space. This includes switching seats every so often so that everyone gets comfortable speaking with one another, simplifying and explaining academic language that can cause confusion or silence, making sure staff quite carefully sort of direct discussion to avoid any one student monopolizing time, keeping class sizes limited so voices don't have to fight for space, integrating small group activities to encourage quieter students to speak, and always making sure to leave adequate space for questions at the end of the discussion. And then finally, students really understood that there are differentiated needs and learning styles within a classroom space, and thus for everyone to be able to participate. It was really important for students that diverse teaching and learning and examination techniques were implemented so that all students could access some of the methods that worked for them. In addition to this, students stressed the importance of also ensuring both classroom and virtual spaces were accessible to students with any disabilities, neurodivergencies, or language barriers. So those are sort of the big things for my project in terms of inclusive participation in particular.
Yeah, thank you. So firstly, I just wanted to kind of give an overview of my experience of giving feedback. So the main thing is that you have the Takara surveys, and there's also an element of direct feedback. So just firstly touching on Takara surveys, I want to make a bit of a distinction between, in my experience, between class teachers and perhaps on a wider scale the course itself. So in my experience, class teachers have actually been much more responsive and immediately reactive to any Takara survey feedback. And I think also students might feel more comfortable giving them this feedback because there's less of a distance between you and your class teacher in terms of how often you interact with them, but also perhaps because, you know, they're doing their PhD or they've recently been in a position that you've been in. And I think there's a difference that arises when there's a lecturer instead, because there is suddenly more distance. There is a much more unequal power dynamic. And especially coming from an ethnic minority, when you don't see very many academics who look like you, it isn't necessarily a space that you feel super empowered in. And in terms of Takara feedback, my experience on a course has been that it is unclear to me whether that feedback is acknowledged, analyzed, because in my experience we don't receive a response. And on the same point, I know this was mentioned earlier, it is unclear to us whether cohorts from previous years have given feedback that has been implemented, because we don't get told these things. And of course, you only take a course for a year, so even if you do give feedback, it's not so clear whether it's actually acknowledged and listened to. So that's one thing with Takara feedback, is that it's unclear to me what actually comes of it. And when you have this feeling of, I'm not sure what this is actually going to do, suddenly leads to, you don't actually want to fill it out in the first place. You'll spend time browsing the internet instead of in your lesson. So that's Takara feedback. And in terms of direct feedback, again, I think there is a distinction between class teachers and lecturers themselves. So I will say that my experience with class teachers has been, again, more positive, where I feel like I have expressed something to a teacher, and there have been more times where they have taken on that feedback. So just an example, in my second year statistics course, I said to a teacher that, we submit these problem sets, but it's not clear to me whether you're looking over our work and correcting our mistakes. And from that point on, it was a sudden change that we were getting regular feedback on a weekly basis, which was really responsive and helpful straight away. As for direct feedback, I have not very many experiences to go for the lecturer, but there was strikes throughout last year, so there was a big delay in receiving feedback on essays. It took a lot of guts to work this up, and I finally dropped an email to a lecturer to say that I think it could be beneficial if in the following year you could perhaps consider taking the best of the formative and the summative essays to actually treat as a summative. Because what was happening was that we'd submit the formative and it would take so long to get feedback that by that point you've more or less already written your summative. So there's not really any help with that. The response I got was that he acknowledged the fact that there was a delay, but there was no acknowledgement of my suggestion. So that was completely overlooked. And at that point, it's kind of like, okay, maybe this isn't something I should do. And again, I think, there's a bit of a power dynamic where this is an expert in their field, in their discipline. You don't feel like you have any kind of power to say, this is what I think, because obviously they know best. So that's another experience. And then one last experience I'd like to draw on is it's not my personal experience, but it is an experience of a peer of mine. But I think it is indicative of something. So there was a course, I think this was at the end of second year again, that had a particularly high fail rate that was published on the statistics on LSE. The fail rate for that course was 34%. And after that, of course, the students were quite upset, and the lecturers offered to hold a town hall for this. And the sentiment coming out of that town hall was that the students felt that the blame had been entirely deflected. It was a case of you didn't work hard enough. Now, I appreciate that this is one instance, and there could be a case of bias where bad news spreads more than good news, and so I'm focusing on this a little bit more. But I think we should maybe use this and take a step back and think, what is this indicative of? And I think what it might tell us is that students often feel that there is an LSE way of doing things. So if there is something you're not understanding, it is not the fact that your professor isn't explaining it to you properly, it's that you're not understanding it. There's something wrong with the way you're learning in this environment. And I think there's something really to be said about that, where we've talked about accessible learning styles and how different students might benefit from different things. And I think it is really, really helpful to have a space where you can actually be like to a lecturer, I don't quite get this way, would you mind explaining it another way? And I think the best example I have is my econometrics professor, who had, so in the lecture he'd have a live chat up where people could actually send him anonymous messages live time during the lecture, which I thought was great because people would say, oh, you're going too fast, could you explain this again, could you provide another example of this? And I think there's something to be learned from that because we've come out of COVID, so we had the Zoom lectures, and I'm watching Dimitri in the room because she did a wonderful job of this, of actually being very active on that chat, of actually looking at what students are saying to her in live time and actually responding to that and acknowledging it. I think otherwise, if you do a whole lecture and you go 6 weeks without being asked for a Takaro survey response, there could be a lot of time where you're like, I'm not sure that I understand this, but I'm not sure how to approach the lecture because I don't feel comfortable, and I'm not sure how to, is there something wrong with me? And it's just all of these things, they create additional barriers that you might already have. So in terms of where I think there could be some space for improvement is that, though I do understand the value of Takaro surveys, it's objective, it's easy to quantify, you can make nice graphs out of it. I think there's value in more qualitative, in-depth feedback. And I really like what was said earlier about pen and paper in the classroom and making it anonymous, because that is an opportunity for someone not to give you, a scaled answer, but actually to tell you how they feel in a bit more detail, which maybe a scale can't capture. And again, I think this is really, really powerful. And for the other side of this, the flip side is that I think that as academics, as teachers, as educators, there should be some kind of framework to almost take on that feedback, principles for you guys to keep in mind when actually you receive that feedback. So, actually approaching with a sense of there's conversation and dialogue. The fact that learning actually goes both ways, not just one way where you are teaching. There's also something to be learned from the way that students are responding to you. Positioning the feedback as developmental to your teaching style. And actually, what I would like to say is that it's important for it to be not just performative or tokenistic, as we often feel that Takaro surveys are, is that it's a tick box. It's actually that no, as an educator, I want this feedback from you, but also I'm going to do something about this because I actually do want to become a better educator. I think it's about empowering students, and when students feel that they have a voice, at that point is when they will actually use it. But up until that point, I think it's very difficult to get students engaged with you, particularly marginalized students, when they feel like that their efforts are not worth anything, and that they can't actually effectively give feedback in a way that will actually help their learning ultimately in the end. Thank you very much.
And last but not least, John Christophe.
Thank you. I'm going to start my presentation by being fairly theoretical, but it's mostly to hide the fact I have none of the amazing projects and studies that were mentioned so far. I only have a few experiences of studying a few years at LSE, but also a few points that I'm trying to work on with the students. And these are the experiences that I'm going to talk about. So when it comes to defining voice, I didn't go very far. I looked at my bookshelf, and there is actually a book from my colleague, Nick Coldry, who wrote Why Voice Matters in 2010. So I looked at the introduction, and I found this fairly handy definition where he says that voice is a value. And I quote him, I shall refer to the act of valuing and choosing to value those frameworks for organizing human life and resources that themselves value voices. So I like this idea of value as being not just the expression, the opinion, even though they are important, we want them in the classroom, but really being something that we should value, put at the center of our teaching, but also value as a framework, right? As a sort of a parameter, things that structure voice. So it led me to think of what are the frameworks, what are the different parameters in my teaching where I try to foster the voice of my students. Frameworks might look a little bit set, right? I like the idea of more framework in progress, so to speak, because these things I'm going to talk about are very much things in progress, right? I talk about them with my students. We have a teaching exchange in my department, which is amazing. We spent just some time to talk about the questions and problems that we face 2-3 hours per term. So yeah, this is the result. What I'm showing here is the result of all of that. The first point I'd like to mention, to talk about, is the idea of naming gender and pronouns. Starting with the idea that, of course, when we're in a classroom, getting to know the names of our students is the basis, right? So we can all have an interesting interaction over the whole term. Students want to use another name than the one that is written on the LSE registry. They also want us to use a different pronoun. So how do we cater for that, basically? What I found interesting in the past year is to start first, during the first course that we have together, usually the seminar works better. We look at the gender inclusive language guidelines that the LSE has. We discuss it. There are some questions sometimes about what it is, why we should do that, should we do that, so we talked a little bit about that. The way I found that it works well to collect that is by asking each student to write a specific info sheet, individual one, where they tell me their name, the name that they might want me to use, their pronouns that they might want me to use instead, and that's something that I collect and that I use throughout the term. Now the question that I still have is, how do we enforce different pronouns in the classroom? Do we ask all the students to remember all of them? Do we generalize the they as default? This is something that I'm still working on, and I'll see next term when I teach my course how do I end out about that. But it's still, again, it's still work in progress. The second point about students' voice is regarding assignments, and my main course is about platforms, digital platforms. In my course, I talk mostly about the EU, US, a bit of Chinese context when it comes to platform and the regulation. There is obviously a wide multipolar world when it comes to platform from many other countries. I cannot cater to that in my own teaching. However, I invite students to use specific cases about platform that they know in the classroom. However, this needs to be followed by a proper reward structure, right? It's good to talk about that, but we need to make sure that also where they can include that within their formative and summative assignments. I always tell them, choose a platform that I don't know. Don't assume I know anything about it, because I most likely will not. So there is a bit of prep work in terms of telling more, but it goes beyond the fact that we all know what Meta and Amazon are. We might start with this standpoint, but there are other platforms that exist around the world that we should acknowledge. Well, that's for the very specific bit. And the last point is about really the content of the course. Something that I came to realize about my specific course is that students were leading me via their topics for formative and summative to talk more about sustainability. Something that I was talking a little bit about, but ended up not that much for timing reasons. I like the idea of thinking of formative and summative as a source of voice also, something that we can use as a form of feedback. Students kind of vote with their feet, so to speak, when they choose a specific topic, right? So I came to realize that's something that I should remediate. And last year, something fantastic that the Eden Center was launched a specific internship program about sustainability, where I could apply and got a bit of money to actually hire research assistants to actually do a bit of work to include sustainability more to the forefront of these of my course. So I guess A more systematic way would have been to do that more collaboratively with all the different students. In that case, it was just with 2 students that we ended up working together, but still, hopefully, all the students for future years in my course will benefit from that. So that's it for me. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes, I think, for Q&A before we move into the group discussions. Does anyone either in the room or online want to kick us off with any questions?
I have a quick question for Olivia. When you mentioned that you have a fixed structure for your course, but then you might change it during the term, and I do that quite often, but I'm usually worried about how students perceive that. What was the response your students gave to when you had to adjust midterm to, given their feedbacks and everything?
Looking across the whole panel, one thing that strikes me is the need to make space, either in the classroom or just somehow finding space for this dialogue. And I was struck by your comment, moving on. I think that that's because there is so much pressure. From the perspective of teachers, you just feel, well, we have to get through this, So somehow we need to schedule space. So I'm trying to think, well, how can LSE as an institution sort of embed that into what we deliver? So in economics, I think it helps to have small cohorts. We have very big cohorts. And what we thought to try and do, for example, was to actually schedule a couple of 1-hour slots in the timetable where we just meet with students and chat. Okay, so creating the space. It was incredibly difficult. For example, I don't know if you know, you cannot book something through the timetabling system unless it's got a course code. So we had to create artificial course codes. So it seems like it would be really helpful if we could think about where to put the space. Is it in the classroom? Is it at the program level? Is it outside the classroom? I think, what will have to be removed also, right? Because I think cramming in more and more is also not maybe helpful to students either. So do you think it's sort of more in the individual classroom that you think that space is useful and maybe you direct it more to the students? Or is the sense of dialogue better at the program, at the course level, both? Where should we put that space for dialogue, do you think?
I feel like in terms of there's different avenues for different things. Like a key point that was mentioned in terms of I feel more comfortable to talk to my seminar teachers rather than a lecturer or course convener, and that's something that in terms of in our IR department, I'm not sure how it goes for different departments, we kind of use our academic rep to facilitate, and we have a great academic rep, someone called Andreas Lowe. He's been our academic rep for I think a couple of years now, so in terms of he's been our main liaison. So I think in terms of maybe different departments will have different cultures of where to create that space, but in terms of sorry, just to go on your point in terms of general feedback. I know some courses also have a thing where 10% of your grade will be a contribution on Moodle, and they will utilize the Moodle forums. So I think in terms of like, it just depends. If you're looking in terms of creating that dynamic and that conversation about the general course, then maybe using academic reps in terms of students can talk to the academic reps to liaison with the lecturer, because maybe some students might not feel confident to do that
Directly.
themselves. Maybe some will, like of course, but I think in terms of the first year you're new to this environment, you have that more institutionalized framework of like this kind of a, not a barrier, but like a system in place. But I think in terms of like seminar, I think in terms of creating that space in the classroom. So as like James had mentioned before, using pen and paper, someone called Martin Bailey, who was like in for IR 200, he actually was doing a thing where like every single term he would tell us to write down what we thought as well, and creating that space for us to give him feedback on, and in terms of like making us feel confident that he'll respond to it. So afterwards when we came back, he was like, oh, this context analysis, where he was like, oh, this was a general thing that students said, and then he kind of shaped the classes to kind of mold that as well. So I think it kind of depends. I know like in terms of like cohort, there's some things where, as someone mentioned before, that things won't change, but in terms of being receptive to the feedback of like why things won't happen, and just making sure that students feel valued and heard. So.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, in terms of space, just from the philosophy department, what we have is lunches with our lecturers or teachers, which I think is a really, really nice idea to meet in a slightly more relaxed setting. So it's in the staff canteen in the old building. Which was really nice. And then every week, the lecturer encourages different students to sign up. So it's not the same students who come every time. It's like, everyone has a chance to rotate. I appreciate that the econ department is massive. So it might be a case of, a lot of class teachers, not just the lecturer, also wanting to do this lunch with students. And I think more generally, what I've always appreciated in a module is almost like a question and answer session, or having, I know that the econ department does do like drop-in sessions, but even with the lecturer, if you have like 20 or 30 minutes at the end where it's more of a, what didn't you understand? What do you want to know more about? What do you need another example of? Which I know you have done yourself. I think that can be really, really helpful, and just to clarify some things and create a space where it's okay to ask questions and be unsure, which otherwise students might not have fully.
Thank you. I'm really sorry that we are going to have to cut this conversation short because to move on to the group discussions. I just wanted to draw people's attention. Gillian, thank you very much for sharing that practice in the chat. The chat's visible in the room, so everyone is able to see that in here as well as online. So I just want to say a very big thank you to our panel. I think everyone in the room comes from different roles. It's going to take away different things from the wealth of kind of insights that you've shared with us. I think for me, the big things have been around kind of student voices, intellectual integrity, intellectual contribution, and the different ways that can manifest in like course structure, contributing to discussions, choosing different readings, assessment, etc. And also the notion of dialogue, which is something I've been thinking a lot about, but I'm kind of thinking about it further now in relation to kind of power, the proximity between the people involved in the conversations, and kind of clarity around purpose for providing feedback. So that's for me personally something that I'm really going to take away from your panel and the panel that we had earlier. So thank you very much for that. And I'm just going to hand over to Claire, who's going to introduce the group activity.
Okay, so before I introduce the activity, I always know that certain people need to leave early. I just want to give a big shout out to my colleagues in the Eden Centre, and in particular Keeley, Lydia, David, who's outside of Max, who've worked so hard to curate this event. When things work more or less well, you're unaware of quite how much invisible labour is going on behind the scenes. And also to thank colleagues online as well for joining us. What we're going to do now is we've listened to a lot of really creative, interesting ideas about dialogue in the classroom, building community with students and enabling students to truly feel their voices are heard, listened to and engaged with. We want to encourage colleagues in the room at your tables to engage with a series of questions. We're going to put colleagues online. If you're able to stay, we'll put you in groups, 2 breakout groups, and we've got a Padlet, which once you've had your conversations or how, as they develop, please populate the tablet, because I feel there's huge wisdom in this room which we can then share out with our broader community. So we can move away from what Emma said, this sort of notion of student voice is performative, because we have NSS scores, which fundamentally we shouldn't really care about at all. We should just care about that our students feel happy, fulfilled, fully fledged members of our community alongside all of us academics and professional staff, and it's a journey. We've still got quite a long way to go. So you'll see the questions they ask you to engage with that point that Claudine raised, what actually is student voice, how do you understand it? And I think obviously what we've seen today is that there are multiple ways of understanding student voice. We want to hear the practice of those of you who weren't on panels today, because we know you've all got a lot to share. So we've asked for examples of student voice activities, and let's hear about where they worked well, but also where they didn't work so well, because, you know, as was said by Olivia, I think earlier, in terms of one of the best ways to learn is to, I think it was Olivia, is to engage with failures, engage with where things don't work so well. That's, I think, in all areas of scholarly practice, sometimes the biggest learning leaps are made when things don't work so well. I don't know what the other question is, but it doesn't matter. There it is. Are there any aspects of student voice you find difficult? So I think that's also an interesting point to think about. And this will, as I say, hopefully we can feed this into a resource alongside the wonderful contributions of our panellists today. So if you don't know who's sitting at your table, introduce yourselves to each other, move if you'd like to, and we'll give you about just under, let's go up till about just between 10 to and 5 to, and then we can draw things to a close and let you get on with your day. So thanks very much.
We'll just have an IR
autonomy on their education in terms of the educational if we want to talk about campaigning and all these different things, I think in terms of what are we doing in terms of how are students shaping their educational environment that's what I think it is. As Katie said before, when everyone does the NSS, they may have their own interpretations of the student voice. I think that's just in the website here. And what impact do I have on LSE wider community structure? How to reach these people who aren't coming with them.
We can't necessarily just say like this is what student voice is and also this is how well we're doing it. It's just not. There's the people are like it's not exactly. They probably think student voice is about like vote the elections, but I would disagree. I think
we understand bureaucracy, but I feel like there's a minute you go overboard that everything needs to be everything needs to be like a forum and consultation and all of these things as well. I think in terms of like what do LSE students when they want to say that they have they to say something like the implementation of the course community response and say this might not happen. No, we can't have a podcast as a summative assessment because this is not really but in terms of like just making do that contributions feel valued in a way. Like I gave my example of like I had some stuff to say during the student Emma had asked to get my email, sent me an email back, and I was like, oh wow, like at least somebody was listening to all of my rants, so it did make me feel like I have a community in terms of to shape LSE.
We over-democratise things to the point where it's just like barring different concerns. So recently we had a student she had some concerns about like size of drink covers, so anti-smoking like fits in our bars, which is something we can easily resolve. Just that's a conversation that they need to have with schools so that they can stop. Instead, she had to go through lots of different hoops. She had to go through putting a policy proposal forward to basically get drink tops. Then that had to go months later, we had to go to a student panel. She then had to defend this I don't think anyone's disagreed with it. She had to defend it, and it had to go to a sortition vote whether or not we can accept it. And the most ridiculous thing in all of this is it didn't mean forestry to be accepted. So it never happened. So on the back of that we met with her, but there's one at the moment. So similar situation, a student put in a concern about the library. So they went to the democracy committee and said, look, I don't think it's fair that people can basically claim seats in the library by putting their bags in them when there's so much demand for libraries, especially within peak exam periods. I want somewhere to study. So yes, you did last year. We weren't in post. What they did last year is they basically said, well look, if you've got a concern, you have to go through a student policy proposal. So the student policy proposal in March, the next student panel in November. So that student, I don't even know if they're a student here now. They have to go through basically 6, 7, 8 months of waiting for something which is so trivial. When it comes to November, it's not going to resolve that. Defend this proposal, which isn't controversial. And for lots of students, it's so frustrating when these barriers, and then you have all these bylaws in place, which bind us to follow a certain procedure. So I think from the student side, it's so frustrating.
Really have changed that.
Yeah.
We've really changed it. Do you want to
I've ripped up lots of the ways. So obviously we elect lots of officials. So I set up a deliberation. Sarah, women's officer, so last week we had the academic elections, so that's postgrad research, postgrad talk, there's different officers there, part-time students, there's representatives there. I think it's good that we have these people. I do think once again it's very democratising. We feel the need, we have a representative for absolutely everyone. Whereas if a student's got a concern,
You can also use
very, very difficult to change the argument about the school. It's actually a very difficult problem, because the underlying principle
inability to make mathematics.
Everybody should be start within the bar, and all the units within the school.
I think our structures in place, they're so archaic. What we have in the SU, we've got academic reps. Obviously, where the academic rep systems within your own department. There's 650 academic reps. Okay? It's digestible. So we've got one academic representation ever here. There's no way in which we have 650 relationships with people. So I think we put works far harder as a look at the system we have, because the academic rep system is basically the skeleton of the student work. You know, the system has been in place for we've got new technology, we've got other ways in which we can engage and get feedback from students. We really need so much of it. And I think if anything, it's a barrier to but yeah, we've made some changes. Almost people, you know, they can lobby us and talk to us about it, making us more accessible. Which would be the inclusion of students. Any students can speak to any of us, whatever piece goes there. So the LGBT also has an LGBT issue, they can speak to that. We can sort of live play our voice and then we can your and students basically make sure 8 to 10, you know, we can make sure that their feedback is taken into consideration. So I think it's something we work with the students ourselves.
My students, they like
Everybody, teacher mode. Turning into teacher mode there. Sorry, I'm determined to end at 5 to the hour in LSE tradition, that we allow people time to get from one activity to the other. So what we had been scrolling on the screen, can we keep that for a moment? I think people are some quotes from students who have given in, submitted expressions of interest to be members of our student education panel, which is led by Lydia over here, student education panel, which is a consultative panel with students from all across the school, from first year undergraduates to PhD students, where we try and discuss and engage and develop ideas to make education better at LSE. And one of the things they're asked to do is ask what student voice means to them and what they think enables or hinders student voice. So there's some really powerful stuff here, and I think sort of it's good to, if you have a chance to have a quick look at them, please do. So I'm going to try and just hear from a couple of people so we can hear a bit of a flavour of some of the discussions going on at the tables as well as online, and I might, if anyone's still left on the line, maybe we should start with our colleagues online, because it's always hard to ensure you feel fully included when we're trying to run a hybrid session. So if anyone online is willing to unmute themselves and share with us a flavour of some of the things you've been talking about, please also remember the Padlet link. We really would like to create a dynamic, living resource and experiment with the notion of not a static resource, but a dynamic resource which is for the school community about how we are grappling at the chalk face to understand what we mean by student voice, both as staff and students in the LSE. So who's going to be bold and unmute themselves and tell us what you're discussing? Anybody? No? Hi. Thank you, that was really powerful, and I'm afraid there's a couple of things I would really like to follow up and ask you about, but I think I should leave the floor to someone in the room to share with us what they were talking about, and then obviously this discussion will be ongoing. So if you have a chance to also type in the Padlet so we can pick up on some of those points around power, community, multi-layeredness and different contextually driven understandings of student voice, that would be great. Who in the room would like to share something about what you were talking about? I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I could put one of my colleagues on the spot. Yeah, thank you, Daniela.
Yeah, I think all the contributions and what has been shared by the students and other colleagues is very interesting, and we're discussing about how student voice is something that is developing as well. So particularly for first year students, we might think there is a voice and some students might have it, but it's kind of like a work in progress. So how can we also contribute to capture and work with them to make sure that there are instances where those voices are developed throughout their years, and that voice gets stronger and stronger in the course of their careers.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. That's a really interesting, different way of looking at student voice. Yeah, go ahead.
Being at the Viking Health Policy, from my conversations with students, I have realized that one of the major impediments, which is structural impediment, is they don't feel safe to express themselves, even in surveys, because they are not sure about anonymity. And we need to address that, because I've been here since my student years for over 20 years, and it has always been the same. We used to have the chance to read the comments made about ourselves. We were sent all these in hard copies. Now we all get metrics, and some metrics are confounded. I mean, it's like student experience. What does this mean? How do you break that down? We never get any information about that. And it's also another impediment is power dynamics. Okay, these lunches with lecturers work very well in terms of socialization and socializing events, but no student would express their real views in front of the lecturer because they would be afraid to do so. And some professors are not accessible, they have huge egos, they don't take criticism, they don't even take disagreement. So how do we empower students to express themselves? And I believe we have to have a centralized system where students can deposit their views, submit something that cannot be traced back to them, and then reflect as an institution and have some conclusions and some actions.
Thank you, that's really.
Yeah, can I just jump on the back? Because we actually had quite a similar conversation. We were actually almost joking that we used to get a lot more responses back in the day when it was on paper, when the surveys were paper-based. And I guess that's exactly to your point, Dina, in that obviously that gave a lot more confidence in the anonymity of the survey, right? Because it's written and then it's collected by an administrator, and there's much more layers between that. I think that's a really good point, Dina. I think it's something that we need to think about as well, about ensuring students feel safe to do that, and maybe going back to paper, as lots of the students see it, is the best way.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, it's one of the sort of overarching themes that have come through to me is how power dynamics mediates this student voice space, and I think it's an area we need to do lots more work in. And I know you spoke about metrics, but what I was going to say in conclusion was I feel that this education forum has been a sort of attempted to sort of push back against the metrification of the higher education spaces that we find ourselves in, thanks to our regulator, and take a much more reflective and slow approach to trying to understand what this rather nebulous concept of student voice means. And we've had so many sort of ways of coming at it from the different presenters as well as people in the room. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of day. We're going to share some resources that come out of this. The Padlet will still be open, so please do continue to have voice in this forum, beyond the forum. Thank you very much.